Wars don't always split the world into clean columns of friend and enemy. Sometimes the most dangerous fracture runs inside the same coalition, between men who salute the same flag of purpose, yet fight by rules that cannot coexist. In Vietnam, reputations were currency, doctrine was religion, and pride. Pride was the one thing no helicopter could evacuate. By the fall of 1967, that pride had become combustible, not because the enemy had changed, but because two Allied forces were looking at the same jungle and seeing two entirely different wars. One believed victory came from weight and fire, the other believed it came from silence and time. And then, in the early hours of a Tuesday in October, that collision finally reached a radio handset in a humid operations bunker, carried on static, sharpened by rage. A voice on static. The duty officer on watch was a young captain, half awake, running on stale coffee and routine. He'd been staring at maps long enough that the contour lines seemed to crawl. A cigarette burned down between his fingers, while his mind drifted briefly to somewhere back home, some clean life that still existed beyond the humidity and the wire. The radio snapped alive. According to accounts that circulated among Allied liaison officers in the weeks that followed, a senior American commander came across that handset, not as a man making a request, but as one delivering a verdict. His voice crackled through interference, but the anger carried clearly, tight, controlled, barely held back. He wanted the Australians out of his area of operations. Gone by sunrise, he didn't care where they went. Then, by those same accounts, it got colder. Send them back to Sydney. Send them to the moon. Just get them away from his men. Veterans who later described the atmosphere in Allied command circles during that period recalled it as one of the most jarring moments of inter-Allied friction in the entire theatre. In 18 months in country, officers had heard plenty of commanders lose their temper. Vietnam manufactured that. Men whose careers and reputations were being worn down in the jungle alongside their soldiers. But this, by those recollections, wasn't the usual fury about weather, supply, or enemy movement. This was personal, visceral contempt, directed at allies, men fighting the same war, on the same side. The complaint, as it was later understood by liaison officers, centered on an accusation that Australian soldiers had compromised a battalion-level operation. They moved like they owned the jungle. They operated outside expected parameters. They endangered American lives. The Australians, especially the SAS, were by most contemporary accounts regarded as among the most effective small unit operators in the entire theatre. Their results made analysts double-check the arithmetic. They operated in areas American units rarely entered. Marines, infantry, and Special Forces personnel who worked alongside them generally held them in high regard. And yet, according to the recollections that filtered through Allied command channels, a senior general wanted them gone. Something had happened out there, something serious enough to shatter professional courtesy between Allied commands. What few outside a small circle fully understood at the time was that the incident in question would be buried under layers of classification and institutional silence for years. Because what had been building in War Zone D, in the same operational region that would, months later, include the battles fought at Fire Support Base Coral, was not simply a disagreement over tactics. It was a collision between two philosophies of warfare, and the aftermath, records suggest, would prove one of them catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong. Hammer and shadow. The American general belonged to a tradition shaped by the Second World War's long grind across Europe and the hard lessons of Korea. By most accounts of those who served under him, he believed in mass, momentum, and overwhelming firepower. His doctrine was straightforward. Find the enemy, fix him, destroy him. Infantry pressure backed by artillery and air. It had worked against the Germans. It had worked in Korea. And as far as he was concerned, it would work in Vietnam. The Australian SAS, by contrast, operated according to principles that veterans later described as almost the philosophical opposite. Small teams, patience, precision. 4- and 5-man patrols moved through the jungle for extended periods, sometimes weeks, living off the land, avoiding contact when possible, and striking only when they could guarantee results that justified the risk. They treated noise as a liability, and time as a weapon. To officers shaped by conventional doctrine, that approach could look like timidity dressed up as professionalism. To the Australians, the American method, by their own later accounts, looked like a sledgehammer swung at insects. Noisy, expensive, and reliably effective at warning the insects to move. The Bien Hoa wound. The first serious friction surfaced during a joint operation in the Bien Hoa area in late September 1967. The American plan called for a company-sized sweep into terrain where intelligence suggested enemy forces were operating. Multiple columns, artillery on standby, gunships overhead. The Australian liaison officer, a captain whose role placed him directly between the two command cultures, raised concerns, according to officers who were present. The terrain favored ambush. A large, noisy force would either push the enemy away before contact or walk into a prepared kill zone. By later accounts of those who observed the exchange, the suggestion was not well received. The general made clear that his men would do this the conventional way. The operation launched at dawn. The force moved through the jungle with little attempt at concealment. Within hours, contact came, but not on American terms. The enemy triggered a classic L-shaped ambush. By subsequent casualty reports, 17 Americans went down in the first several minutes of contact. The engagement that followed lasted the better part of a day, confused, costly, and ultimately inconclusive. The enemy withdrew on their own schedule, carrying their casualties with them, leaving nothing useful behind. The general, by accounts of officers present at subsequent briefings, assigned the failure to terrain, luck, and intelligence quality. His own approach, in his assessment, had not been the variable. Less than 3 kilometers away, an Australian SAS patrol had been operating in the same area for 4 days. They had counted movement, mapped routes, and identified what appeared to be a significant enemy command presence. They had not engaged. They had observed, recorded, and reported. Several days later, based on documented patterns of guard rotation and movement they had compiled, they called in precision artillery. Post-strike assessments suggested significant enemy casualties and a destroyed logistics element. No Australian casualties, no firefight. By the accounts of officers who reviewed the after-action reports, barely a detectable footprint left behind. The contrast was stark enough that, under different circumstances, it might have prompted a serious command-level conversation about methods. Instead, records suggest it deepened resentment. To some senior American officers, Australian success on those terms didn't look like a method worth studying. It looked like an implicit rebuke. Before Coral, that resentment hardened during the large American push into War Zone D that followed, an extended operation that by most contemporary assessments consumed enormous resources while producing limited results. Enemy formations that were supposed to be fixed and destroyed were frequently not where the maps said they should be. Casualties accumulated from booby traps, heat, and ambushes. The enemy, for the most part, stayed invisible. During that same period, a small Australian patrol moved into the same operational area on foot. By the accounts of the men involved and the patrol reports they filed, they advanced slowly, avoided known trails, maintained strict noise and radio discipline, and spent 9 days building a precise picture of what they were looking at. What they found, according to those patrol reports, was significant. The enemy hadn't retreated. They had gone underground, a tunnel complex with entrances, storage, sleeping quarters, and what appeared to be command space, located within a few kilometers of American positions in War Zone D. American units had been operating in the area without detecting it. The patrol returned with maps, photographs, and documented patterns, intelligence that by the assessment of the officers who received it should have been immediately actionable. It was logged. Then, according to subsequent accounts by Australian liaison officers, largely set aside. Weeks later, enemy forces emerged from that general area and struck a supply convoy. 11 Americans were killed and several vehicles destroyed before the attackers withdrew and disappeared again, reportedly near the very locations the Australian patrol had already documented and reported. That was the atmosphere, pride, institutional rivalry, and a pattern of refusing to integrate what allies were offering when, in the early hours of October 17th, an Australian patrol detected what their reports described as significant enemy movement toward American positions in War Zone D, months before the same contested ground would see the fierce battles later fought at Fire Support Base Coral, and attempted to pass that warning to American forces before the situation developed. The storm before Tet. By late 1967, the war had begun generating warnings that, in retrospect, pointed towards something far larger than the engagements anyone had been planning for. Australian SAS patrols operating across Phuoc Tuy and adjacent provinces were among the first to document the change, according to patrol logs and intelligence summaries from the period. Weapons and supplies moving south in higher volumes, regular NVA formations shifting positions in ways that suggested deliberate repositioning rather than routine movement. Routes that had carried predictable traffic began carrying something that felt, to experienced observers, like urgency. Australian intelligence assessments forwarded through official channels during this period described what analysts interpreted as preparation for a large-scale operation. The enemy, by their reading, was not preparing for another isolated engagement. They were building toward a climax. American command received these assessments. Analysts elsewhere in South Vietnam were independently noting fragments of the same pattern. The broad conclusion that something significant was coming was not by most accounts disputed. What was disputed was the target. Prevailing American intelligence assessments, shaped in part by the operational experience of the previous 2 years, leaned toward the interpretation that major enemy efforts would be directed against military installations, forward positions, and remote outposts in areas like War Zone D, which would later become the site of the battles at Fire Support Base Coral in May 1968. The response followed conventional logic: reinforce defensive positions, intensify patrol activity, prepare to repel assaults with overwhelming firepower. Australian patrol reports, by contrast, pointed in a different direction. Enemy reconnaissance activity, as their teams had observed and documented it, was focused on towns, district centers, and provincial capitals. Supplies were being cached near populated areas. The inference their analysts drew, and forwarded through the chain of command, was that the enemy intended to strike cities, not jungle outposts. That assessment, according to later accounts by Australian officers involved, reached American command. It was noted, and largely set aside. Tet ignites. On January 30, 1968, the Tet Offensive began. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces attacked more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations simultaneously across South Vietnam. The war moved off the jungle trails and into urban streets in a matter of hours. Places that had been considered secure were contested before sunrise. Provincial capitals came under direct assault. Saigon itself was struck. Units that had been trained and mentally prepared for rural operations found themselves fighting house to house in cities they had not expected to defend. The Bien Hoa area was hit hard. Reports indicated enemy forces had infiltrated the city itself and were operating from within civilian neighborhoods. Command needed immediate intelligence, locations, numbers, intentions. Aircraft couldn't distinguish enemy from civilian. Signals monitoring was largely ineffective in an urban environment where the enemy had deliberately minimized radio use. An emergency request was forwarded to Australian headquarters. Ghosts in the city. The Australian response, according to operational records and the accounts of participants, came within hours. 2 small teams, 8 soldiers in total, were inserted into Bien Hoa before sunset. Moving in civilian clothing with concealed weapons, they separated and moved into the city. For 3 days they operated with minimal detectable footprint. They mapped enemy assembly points, located supply caches, identified command positions, and relayed targeting information that allowed airstrikes and artillery to be directed with a precision that American forces, working from degraded intelligence, could not otherwise have achieved. Enemy attacks that might have been allowed to consolidate were disrupted in their assembly phase. American and South Vietnamese units regained control of key areas more quickly than the early hours of the offensive had suggested would be possible. All 8 Australians extracted safely after 72 hours. The American Marine colonel who had requested their assistance produced an after-action assessment that, by subsequent accounts, pulled few punches. According to those who read it, he wrote that the Australian patrol had generated more usable intelligence in 3 days than his own reconnaissance assets had produced in 3 months. He recommended that American forces study Australian methods and consider how to integrate them, a statement that, within the circles that read it, functioned as pointed institutional criticism. Pride and consequence. The Tet Offensive failed militarily. The attacking forces suffered catastrophic casualties, gained none of the popular uprising they had anticipated, and were driven back from every position they had taken. But it reshaped the war politically and psychologically in ways that military outcomes alone could not reverse. Within Allied command, it had one additional effect. Questions began circulating about what had been anticipated and what had been missed. The pattern of Australian intelligence assessments that had been dismissed, warnings that had gone unheeded, and coordination that had broken down under institutional friction was difficult to examine without reaching uncomfortable conclusions. The general at the center of those tensions was reassigned to a staff position in the months that followed. Officially, the move was characterized as routine rotation. By the accounts of officers who observed the command environment at the time, confidence in his judgment had quietly collapsed. His successor, according to those present at their first meeting with Australian Command, opened by acknowledging the tensions that had preceded him and asking what it would take to make the partnership work effectively. The Australian commander's answer was uncomplicated. Listen to the intelligence, trust the methods, and allow the teams to operate. The results, by subsequent operational assessments, came quickly. Australian reconnaissance was integrated into American operational planning at a meaningful level. Joint training exchanges followed. Techniques refined during those collaborations would later influence special operations doctrine in multiple Allied militaries, a development that would have seemed improbable to anyone observing the relationship in the autumn of 1967. Lessons written in war. Years after the war ended, the deeper consequences of those events came into clearer focus. A journalist who interviewed the retired general in 1982 later recorded, in notes archived with his papers, that the old man acknowledged his greatest mistake had not been tactical, it had been personal. He had been too certain of his own methods to absorb what Allies were demonstrating, even when the evidence placed directly in front of him demanded reconsideration. What stayed with him most, according to those notes, were the casualties suffered after warnings had gone unheeded. He acknowledged that pride had prevented him from learning at the precise moment when learning would have cost the least and saved the most. He died in 1985. His Vietnam service received brief mention in official records, the controversy surrounding his command largely absent from public memory. Australian SAS veterans returned home to limited public recognition. They continued the quiet tradition they had maintained throughout the war. Small teams, minimal publicity, results that consistently exceeded what their numbers suggested should be possible. Over time, the principles they had practiced in the Vietnamese jungle became foundational to how the most capable special operations forces in the world now understand their purpose. Patience, intelligence-driven operations, precision over mass. The methods that were once dismissed as unconventional are, by most contemporary military assessments, now the definition of elite. The soldiers who were once viewed with suspicion became the model. What the jungle taught. The story of those months in Vietnam is not simply a historical episode about Allied friction and competing doctrines. It is a study in how certainty becomes a liability, how the same confidence that makes a commander decisive in one context can make him blind in another. The general at its center was not, by most accounts, a foolish man. He was experienced, decorated, and by his own lights was prosecuting the war correctly. But experience, when it hardens into doctrine that can no longer be questioned, stops functioning as wisdom and starts functioning as a wall. He looked at Australian methods and saw what he expected to see. Something foreign, something that didn't conform to his understanding of how wars were supposed to be fought. He did not, by any account that survives, seriously ask whether his understanding might be incomplete. The words he reportedly spoke in anger that October night, demanding that the Australians be removed, sent anywhere, just away from his men, did not survive as a simple expression of frustration. They survived as a warning. In war, as in most things that carry real consequences, the greatest danger is often not the enemy clearly visible in front of you. It is the certainty that prevents you from seeing clearly beside you.